So before we get started talking about today's text, we're going to do a brief exercise in comparative democracy. Are any of you poli-sci majors? Oh, we'll take your resounding silence to mean no. But a couple of you are history majors, right? Do you know what proportional representation means? Is this something you've ever heard of? Okay, this is how most other advanced democracies select their legislators, right? Now, we have what's called a first-past-the-post electoral system, right? So what that means is that we get two candidates running for a single seat in a district, right? And the first candidate to get to 51% automatically gets the seat, even if 49% of the people in that district didn't vote for that person, right? So what happens to those other 49% of the votes? Wasted, right? Basically pointless. So what proportional representation tries to do is avoid some of the weird vagaries of a first-past-the-post system, right? So for example, in the 2012 electoral cycles, more people cast votes for Democratic candidates for Congress than cast votes for Republican candidates for Congress. But because of the way our districts are drawn in our first-past-the-post systems, Republicans maintain an advantage in the Senate and the House, right? So in proportional representation, this doesn't usually happen. The control of the legislature usually very closely mirrors the percentage of the vote a particular party got, right? So the number of seats they'll get in the legislature is very, very close to the percentage of votes they got as in the electoral cycle. The other great thing about electoral cycles in other countries, they usually only last about 2 weeks, right? We wouldn't have had this long ongoing circus. I started getting emails at the end of 2014 saying, "Are you ready for Hillary?" No, I don't want to think about this. And that was back when it looked like it was just going to be a really boring sort of battle between two dynasts, right? So, good times. But okay, so here's how proportional representation works, right? You're given a list of candidates, and you rank them in order of preference. You need a certain number of first choice votes to automatically get a seat. And once a certain candidate reaches that first choice threshold, okay, congratulations, you get a seat. And then we start looking at people's second choice ballots and third choice and so on, right? So no one's vote is actually wasted. Now, I have found that I am usually able to give people their first or second choice preference when we do the group presentation. And we do this through a form of sort of proportional representation democracy, right? Essentially what I want you to do, I'll tell you a little bit about each of these texts, and then you are going to rank them in order of preference. Number 1 would be the one you most want to work on. Number 5 would be the one you are least interested in working on. Okay, so first choice is Oedipus the King by Sophocles, regarded by many as the classic Greek tragedy. If your favorite text that we've looked at so far was Medea, this is probably the way to go. This is probably what you want to choose. Second choice, the Ramayana of Valmiki. This is an ancient Indian epic. It's similar in some ways to the Bhagavad Gita, but is older and is a little bit less metaphysical, a little bit less philosophically complex. So if you were interested in the Bhagavad Gita, if you were interested in the Chinese philosophy that we looked at in general, sort of the Eastern religion stuff that we've been doing, then this is probably the way you want to go. The Song of Roland is an anonymous medieval romance in verse. It's about a clash in northern Spain between a Christian army and a Muslim army, a sort of proto-Crusades kind of narrative that portrays the two clashing cultures in really complex and interesting ways. So if you're interested in knights on horseback and people waving swords around and shouting things, then this is probably what you want to choose. The Tale of Genji is a Japanese novel from the imperial period. It's not, most of the characters in it are samurai, but it's not very action oriented. It's mostly about court culture and personal relationships. And your final choice are these selections from Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, which is a satirical early modern romance about a guy who's read too many stories about knights and goes off in search of his own knightly adventures. So if anybody has any questions about any of these, feel free to ask. You're going to be in, there are roughly 20 people in the class. You're going to be split up into roughly groups of 4. Some groups might be a little bit larger than others simply because we have a slightly odd number of people. So rank these in order of preference. When you are done, pass them forward, pass your sheet forward. Yes, Reagan.
So you're going to put us in groups based on what we pick?
Yes, that's how this is going to work. And like I said, I've almost always been able to give people their first or second choices. So, oh, and also don't put your name on it. Put your put your ID number on it instead, so that nobody can accuse me of playing favorites. Right? Essentially, what I'm going to do. Right, I'm just going to take them home. I'm going to toss them up in the air, mix them up, and randomize them that way. I'm sorry, that's a very important part that I forgot to mention.
5 is least favorite, right?
5 is least favorite, yeah. Yep. That was fast.
He was ready. All right, have we got everybody? No, not you. Okay, and not you. Okay, now we've got everybody. Yes? No. Of course not. All right. We'll talk about this on Thursday, right? So I will go home tonight. Wednesday, yes, I'm sorry. Really rough weekend. We'll talk about these on Wednesday. So I'll go home tonight and arrange you all into groups. You'll have the groups on Wednesday and the assignment.
So, I know, like, it sounds early to be working on this, but really, I do want to make sure that everybody has plenty of time to get it done, because it's not a conventional exam. Okay, any more questions about this? Okay, great. Then let's get back to the texts. All right, so today I asked you to read a short selection from the Quran. How'd this go for you? Yeah, Jenna?
Were we supposed to read to 865 or 869?
To 869. I'm sorry, that was a misprint on the. I did mention in class to read all of the feast.
Okay, that's what
So,
I read.
yeah.
All of it.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry about I'm sorry about the typo on the syllabus. But yeah, I wanted you to read all of these. Well, I wanted you to read the opening and all of the surah called the feast.
I didn't think you wanted us to stop in the middle of it.
No. All right, so yeah. No, I apologize for the typo, but yeah, again, if there is, look, if there is some question about something on the syllabus, there's something that looks confusing, right? In the future, please do email me and let me know, right? Because it just, I'm human, I make mistakes, and sometimes things slip past my attention. Okay, so apart from my little snafu there, how'd this go for you? What did you think?
Pretty easy. Interesting.
Okay.
There
What?
were some pretty repetitive things because they kept saying specific sentences over and over again. Like, I had it written down. God has the power to do all things, and God is most forgiving, most merciful, with an underlying those things.
Yeah, and those are, those and certain other sentences are not just repeated throughout this particular section, but are repeated throughout the entire text, yeah. There are certain formulaic sentences that appear over and over and over again. And that has something to do with the origins of the text, we think, that we'll talk about in a little bit. What were you going to say, Secret?
I was just going to piggyback off of what Jenna said, because I also saw that, and what I saw from it was be mindful of God, instead of reminding them, this is what he expects, and this way that you do this, or this is what he expects you to know.
Yeah, Ty.
Like in the beginning, it seemed like he was listing the amendments like from the Bible, but like in their own way, I guess.
In their own translation.
Yeah.
Their own translation, the way that they saw and understood the Torah.
Yeah, and this, these are traditions that Muhammad and his earliest followers would have been familiar with. They would have been familiar with Judaism, they would have been familiar with the Jewish scriptures, they were familiar with Christian traditions as well. So yeah, there's not necessarily any real surprise that they would be adapting these older traditions. Essentially, the way these ancient texts are regarded by Muslims are essentially there are 5 texts that they hold as being divine revelations. Right, first, the Jewish Torah, right, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Secondly, the Psalms. Third, the Gospels. And fourth, did I say 5? I meant 4. Fourth is the Quran. So they regard the Quran as the latest and indeed last in a series of divine revelations. The Jewish prophets are all revered in Islam, so they call them Nabi. prophets. I remember when I used to live in the East Village in New York City, and there was a mosque a couple of blocks from my apartment, and I would walk down the street and I'd see on the side of it, written on the side of the building was, there is no God but God, and Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, so on and so forth, to Jesus, to Muhammad, are his prophets, right? So yeah, so they do regard the Quran as just the latest link in a chain of divine revelations.
This is Muslim?
Yeah, this is right, Islam, yeah. You had a hand up, Savannah. What were you going to say?
I just thought it was interesting. This one part says, "You who believe do not take Jews and Christians as allies. They are allies only to each other.
Uh-huh.
And who takes them as allies becomes one of them, and God does not guide such wrongdoers." I
Yeah.
just thought that was interesting that they believe that it's only, like we're talking about with the Japanese belief, you can have multiple with this.
Yeah.
It's like straightforward, you cannot do anything else at all. Like,
Yeah. This is a very, very different religious concept from what we were talking about with the Chinese and Japanese religions. Yeah, Jenna.
Also, in response to what she was saying, they say something just a few paragraphs after that on page 867 about the Christians and Jews. That
Yeah.
you are sure to find that the closest in affection towards the believers are those who say, "We are Christians, for they're among them." So it's like a contradiction in they're saying
Yeah,
they're not
it's-
allies, but like there's this sort of contradiction that they are good
Yeah.
people. Though.
And it's not necessarily a contradiction, but the attitude is very complicated.
That's what I'm saying.
Towards,
It complicates things.
Yeah, there are other religious groups who Muslims regard as peoples of the book.
Yeah.
And by peoples of the book, what they mean are other believers in the revealed Abrahamic religion. So this would include Jews and Christians, and also a kind of mysterious group called the Sabians, whom nobody really knows all that much about, but seem to have been active in the Arabian Peninsula and in Persia around the time of Muhammad's career. Yes?
Well, I was going to ask about the same thing.
Sure.
So, when they say don't take Jews and Christians as allies,
Mhm.
they take stuff from the Torah, don't they? That's Jewish.
They do. Now here's what's this is actually exactly where I was going next, so thank you for the question. Essentially, the way Muslims regard the Jewish and Christian scriptures, right? They do believe these as having been revealed by God, but they regard the people as having missed the message, right? Somewhere along the way, the message got garbled, the message got screwed up. So the Jews and the Christians, and I guess the Sabians as well, whoever they were, are following, according to Muslim tradition, a version of God's law, but it's a version that's been corrupted and needs to be corrected. And that's what makes the Quran necessary for them. Yeah, Savannah.
Kind of like how in the Bible it talks about not eating certain animals and all that kind of stuff, but now we do, like it's been changed and stuff like that. Kind of like that concept of not following the right version sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that premise arose out of meat. If you ate pig back in that time, it killed you. So it was just like...
Right, well, right, it was, or at the very least, yeah, pork was hard to preserve, yeah, and if you didn't cook it enough, you got trichinosis and died. So yay. But yeah, so some of those dietary restrictions were based on health restrictions. But yeah, there are some cultures that never abided by those restrictions in general. I think what happens with those Jewish, I mean, there is a point in the Gospels, I think, where Jesus says that the old laws don't apply anymore. But really, where we see that stuff getting thrown by the wayside not wearing blended fabrics, and not eating the meat of certain animals, and not forcing your wife to go live in a tent in the backyard when she's menstruating, that sort of thing. I mean, in part, like, some of that stuff is really impractical, right? Some of that stuff is really, really difficult to do. Secondly, a lot of it disappears as Christian missionaries are making outreach to groups of Gentiles, groups of non-Jews, who don't abide by these strictures, right? When Christianity is expanding outward from being a Jewish splinter sect into being something different. And some Jews don't follow those laws because they regard the destruction of the temple as having rendered those laws at least sort of temporarily null and void. Right? Well, we don't have a temple anymore, so we can't do half of the things in the book of Leviticus anyway, which command us to go to the temple. So, we'll keep the laws that still apply, right? So, for example, like most observant Jews still won't eat pork or certain kinds of fish. I know my wife is Jewish. I have to be very, very careful about what kinds of foods I bring home, right? If I'm going to buy fish at the supermarket, I always have to run it by her first, like, okay, is this kosher? Can you eat this? All right, good. Yeah, shellfish and bottom feeders are not okay. But yeah, Islamic dietary law and Jewish dietary law are actually in a lot of ways very similar. That's one thing that seems to be borrowed pretty much almost directly. Now, if we look at page 861, when they're sort of giving, when he's discussing these dietary rules, right? You are forbidden to eat carrion, blood, pig's meat, any animal over which any name other than God's has been invoked, any animal strangled, or victim of a violent blow or a fall, or gored or savaged by a beast of prey, unless you still slaughter it in the correct manner, or anything sacrificed on idolatrous altars. You are also forbidden to allot shares of meat by drawing marked arrows, a heinous practice. Today the disbelievers have lost all hope that you will give up your religion. So what do you notice going on in these do you notice any particular ideas animating these dietary laws, connecting them together?
Something with the dying by violence.
Yeah. And this is actually one thing that Islamic dietary law has in common with kosher law, right? Is that you are not supposed to slaughter animals cruelly. Right? You are supposed to do so as humanely as possible. So,
like
yeah.
Giving some kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but doing it humanely is like the way that God would do things. Like, I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, well, at any rate, you should not be unduly cruel to an animal you're about to kill for meat, right? That's the basic idea here, right? Don't strangle it, right? Don't let it bleed to death after being gored by another beast, right? Don't knock it over.
Be kind.
Be as kind as you can to something that is going to be food, anyway. Now, there's another element to this here, too. Don't eat food that's been shared out by marking with arrows. Don't eat food that's been, that the name of another god has been invoked over. Don't eat food that has been sacrificed on idolatrous altars. What else are they referring to here? Yeah, remember those old sacrificial meals, right? Now, you didn't sacrifice in the ancient world an animal just because you were going to give it to the gods, right? You sacrificed it because you wanted to eat it. And you were going to give some portion of it, like, for the smoky savor to the gods, right? It's like, okay, I want to eat this bull, but I have to give the gods their portion. So I sacrifice it in the approved manner. Yeah, Devin.
So if they sacrifice that animal, they can't eat the meat from that animal, or they can't eat that animal from the norm.
They cannot eat an animal that has been sacrificed to an idol. Right? So the Islamic God concept is really, really pretty strict in a lot of ways. Yeah, Jalen.
Why weren't they just vegetarians?
Well, because steak is delicious. I mean, also, the fact of the matter is, remember too where Islam first arose, right? What is most of the Arabian Peninsula?
Desert.
Most of it's desert, yeah. So it's, agriculture is really difficult. So vegetarianism would be an impractical lifestyle. So yeah, where was I going with this? Something about idols, right? Yes, God concept. Okay, so in Christianity, how many parts is God supposed to have?
3.
3, right? So Father, Son, Holy Ghost, right? In Islam, there's just Allah. The Father, Son, Holy Ghost. They do not believe that Allah would take human form. Right? The idea of a God taking human form and coming to earth seems to them blasphemous.
They seem to hold some of them. I was making a comparison in my head earlier of the priestly view of God to how they view God. It seems very similar, like law and ritual. I wrote this down. Law-giving person, less human and more distant. Organized state region, because they were very organized in the way that they did it. So there's a very correlation between.
Yeah. And that's a good catch, and it's I would argue that Islam and Judaism are more like each other than either is like Christianity, and I think some of that is because Christianity spread out further from its place of origin, and mixed with other traditions in ways that Judaism and Islam did not. Christian missionaries, early Christian missionaries, often incorporated local belief systems in some way into their preaching as the religion started to spread. The Jews don't proselytize at all. Jewish is both an ethnicity and a religion.
And hereditary.
Yeah, through the mother. If you have a Jewish mother, you're regarded as automatically Jewish. Yes, Erica.
Okay, so basically they took from Jewish religion and Christianity and then added their own. It's like that y'all are doing it wrong.
Well, it's not so much even an adding as it is a different interpretation of tradition, right? What they are arguing is that the Jews and the Christians have misinterpreted the divine revelation, and that so a final revelation is necessary to correct everything.
Oh, okay.
And one of the things they say the Christians have got wrong is this idea of a sort of 3-in-1 God, right?
Right.
No, God for a Muslim is just a unitary entity, right? Just one single God. And they're so the thing about idolatry is the thing against idolatry is so severe that God must never be represented in human form. That would be blasphemy. And even the depiction of the human form in art is really frowned upon in Islam. If human beings were made in God's image, then if the human body is an image of the divine, then to make an inferior representation of that image is also blasphemous. So, Savannah, I'm sorry, you were very patient. You had a hand up.
Well, don't we get Father, Son, and Holy Ghost mainly from the Jawas, the Elohist, and the priestly, because they were the ones that we see them throughout the whole Bible, like making points like Jawas, human-like, the Elohist, God communicates the dreams and stuff. And the priestly, like as she was saying, God is a remote and powerful person. So isn't the Quran older than the Bible? Or am I wrong?
No, it's not, and I think.
'Cause
Yeah, you are correct in that the representations of God in the Torah tend to vary a bit based on when particular parts were written.
it just seems like the priestly is just what they took away from certain texts instead of.
Right. One thing I will say, the Trinity thing is a specifically Christian concept. Jews don't believe in a triple God either. Right? The Yahweh of Jewish tradition is like Allah, a single God. The idea of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit enters into early Christianity. I think it's influenced by Greek philosophy. I think that's how it gets in there. And it's most articulated in the latest of the Gospels, just the Gospel of John. So where was I going with this? Have I answered your actual question? Sort of, okay. But yeah, and I think sort of like where they're getting their focus on the priestly traditions, right, is that most of what Muhammad and his followers would have known of Judaism would have been ritual and would have been ritual prescription. There were a lot of Jews living in the Arabian Peninsula in the late 6th, early 7th centuries.
So it's more like Confucianism than the Zen or whatever. I can't remember the.
Taoism? Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah,
Mhm.
like so it's more like the Confucian side of it than the Taoist side of it because they focused on ritual side of things.
Yeah, and I think there's another way this is kind of similar to Confucianism, right? Now, Confucius, we know, was basically constructing a new method, right? Basically constructing a new tradition. But he did so by arguing that we had the way once in the past, right? And we lost it. It had somehow been misinterpreted along the way, and so we needed to get back to the original way and figure it out. Now, the solution is a little bit that Muhammad comes up with is a little bit different, but he seems to be operating in a similar kind of way, right? God gave his revelation to the peoples of the book. They garbled it. They got it all mixed up and confused. And so now we need to clarify it and get back to the original intent and the original way. Now, a lot of the reason this arises the way it does has to do with politics and history in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Does anybody know what the two big powers in that region would have been? The two big powers contending over the Middle East.
The Byzantines and Persia.
Yeah, exactly. Good, Frank. Yeah, to the west, you had the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire was sort of the successor empire to Rome, right? Essentially, it was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. They spoke Greek, followed primarily Greek cultural traditions, and the officially supported religion of the Byzantine Empire was Christianity. And then to the east, in what is now Iran and Iraq, what was then called Persia, we had with the Sassanid Empire. And the Sassanids, one, were longtime enemies of the Romans because they were competing for influence. And they followed a religion called Zoroastrianism. That was the official state religion of Persia prior to Islam. Have any of you ever heard of Zoroastrianism?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, okay, Frank, what do you know about Zoroastrianism?
It is believed to be the oldest monotheistic religion in the world.
Right, certainly the oldest that's still practiced, yeah.
It was a big religion in that region until Islam came and just basically wiped it out.
Yeah. It's been a minority religion in Iran and in India for a long time.
It had the first concepts of like, a creator deity and a just good and evil God and devil kind of relationship.
Yeah, it's what's called a dualistic religion. It's similar in some ways. You remember we talked about those Gnostic sects last time, who believed that the material world was created by an evil shadow of the good God who reigned over a transcendent realm. Some of these ideas are probably taken from Zoroastrianism, right? In Zoroastrianism, there's a good God called Ormazd, which means wise Lord.
Okay, how do you spell that?
Ohrmazd. And he is locked in a constant cosmic struggle with an evil being called Angra-Mainyu. Angra-Mainyu. And the goal, yeah, sure. Angra-Mainyu. And Angra-Mainyu is the evil spirit in Zoroastrianism. Sort of the equivalent of the devil, right? And so these two are kind of locked in constant struggle over control of the universe. So these two powers have a great deal of influence in the Arabian Peninsula in this period, right? They both want it, not for the reason that it's wealthy today. Where does the Arabian Peninsula get most of its wealth today?
Oil.
Yeah, oil. Yep. Biggest oil producing states, right? All that oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. But of course, in the 6th and 7th centuries, no one would have had any use for petroleum, really, right? There's no, people weren't driving cars. So, where is Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, located in relation to, say, Europe and India?
Right in the middle.
It's right in the middle, yeah, so right on, exactly. Yeah, there were towns in Arabia that got very, very rich through trade. Most of the trade coming from Europe, especially coming from the Byzantine Empire through to India, had to go through the Arabian Peninsula. So, towns like Mecca, where Muhammad was born, became very, very wealthy. Now, most of these wealthy Arabian towns followed, at the time, a religion that was closer to old Semitic paganism, right? So like the old religion of, say, like the Canaanites or the Babylonians. The gods they worshipped were sort of the descendants of those older gods, like sort of shadowy versions of it, right? They like
Fertility gods.
Yeah, fertility gods, right? So like gods like sort of Shamash and Marduk and whatnot sort of faded into local nature spirits. And these deities were worshipped at sanctuaries that were called harams. So haram was a kind of privileged space where fighting was illegal. You had to behave yourself in the haram, whatever grievances you had with other people who happened to be there. So these harams became important safe spaces for building things like a marketplace, right? If you're not allowed to fight in the haram, right, you can trade there safely. So these towns that were built around important harams became very wealthy trading centers. The haram in Mecca was called the Kaaba. And it's still there. Have any of you ever seen like photographs or video footage of the annual pilgrimage to Mecca? And you see just like hundreds of thousands of people in the center of that sort of city square walking around that shrine. That shrine in the middle is the Kaaba. And yeah, it's very ancient. It's been there a very long time. According to Islamic tradition, it is where Abraham first preached the law of God. But actually, historically, it was one of these harams to an older pagan god that is then later repurposed. So, Muhammad was born into a clan called the Hashim and a tribe called the Quraysh.
How do you spell
Quraysh. Around the year 570.
DC or E or AC?
CE, so yeah, common era. Now, the family that he was born into, the clan that he was born into, were actually the guardians and stewards of the Kaaba. Right? It was their job to protect and maintain the haram, which made them very, very powerful locally. And in fact, when he first began his career as a preacher, his most important enemies were his own clan and family, because they had so much to gain, so much to hold on to by maintaining their status as the stewards of this haram. So he doesn't start preaching until he's about 40 years old, which is when he receives his first revelation. And you may have noticed, how is the passages from the Quran here that you read, does it seem to be Muhammad who is speaking?
It's like a mix of Muhammad, God, and speaking to oneself or one's.
It's actually not supposed to be Muhammad speaking at all.
It's the angel Gabriel, correct?
Yeah, the common belief is that the scriptures of the Quran were revealed to Muhammad by the angel Jibreel or Gabriel. Some are written as though it's God speaking directly to Muhammad. Some are written as though it's an angel speaking to him. But it's never Muhammad who is the speaker here, right? Sometimes the you is addressed to Muhammad specifically, and sometimes the you is addressed to his followers more generally. But yeah, it's never actually supposed to be Muhammad speaking. It's God speaking through him, right? Well, actually speaking not even through him, but to him. Right? It's all direct address, then related back. So, he has his first revelations around 610. And, how do people usually respond to prophets when they first say, hey, I had a revelation.
Sounds crazy.
Yeah. It's like, hey, nutso, get out of here, right? And so he begins attracting followers in Mecca among the lower classes. By and large, the powerful clans don't want anything to do with him or with his message. And eventually, he and his followers are forced out of Mecca. They're actually invited to another town, which becomes known as Medina, which is probably the second holiest city in Islam, right? Mecca is considered so sacred that non-Muslims are not permitted to enter it. Medina is probably the second most sacred Islamic city. And in Medina, essentially Muhammad is there, he's invited there to help resolve local, essentially disputes between local Arab tribes and local Jewish tribes. And some of the surahs, or sections of the Quran, are composed in Mecca, some are composed in Medina. The one that you read for today, the feast, is one of the Medina surahs. And one of the differences between the Meccan and Medina surahs is that there's much more focus on these various peoples of the book and a lot of the Medina composed surahs, because this is who he was dealing with at the time. Now, as far as these surahs are concerned, just a brief word about the surahs generally. We usually translate surah as chapter. And right, each of these numbered sections, right, the feast, Jonah, Joseph, Mary, right, purity, each of these is a surah. But the actual Arabic word means something closer to revelation. So each surah is regarded as a distinct revelation from God to Muhammad. Now, how would you expect these surahs would be arranged in the text? In what order would they appear, would you think?
Just chronologically.
Yeah, you would think it's some kind of chronological order, right? It's like, okay, this one happened first, this one happened next, and so on and so forth, right? But they're not. The chronological order is muddled. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I read the thing beforehand about the history of it.
Yeah.
And it's actually some of the ones that came at the end of his life were actually at the beginning of the Quran.
Right.
But then there are some that, come at the beginning of his life, they're at the end.
Right. And it's not even a reverse chronology that we've got. Really, the way they're arranged
So muddled.
is by length. Longest first, with the exception of the opening. And the shortest last. And this is perhaps because it's in the longest surahs that things like law and the nature of God are discussed. And the shortest are primarily made up of relatively brief prayers. So there are 5 things that the Quran requires all of Muhammad's followers do. Right? These are referred to as the 5 pillars of Islam. Just as a brief digression here as well, this is related to the sort of the Muslim God concept. Islam in Arabic means submission, and a Muslim literally is one who submits. Okay, so first of the 5 pillars is salat, or prayer. You are expected to pray 5 times a day, wherever you are, right? Stop what you're doing, roll out your prayer mat, bow and pray towards Mecca, right? You always pray in the direction of Mecca, wherever that happens to be. The piece of music that I was playing for you as you came in was actually a call to prayer. In Islamic cities and sometimes in Islamic neighborhoods within cities where Muslims are a minority, you will hear a muezzin, that's the guy who gives the call to prayer, go up into a tower and he'll sort of give this call. Everybody in the neighborhood will hear it, and then they know, okay, it's time for me to unroll my prayer mat and start praying. The original direction of prayer was Jerusalem, but as Muhammad got into disputes in Medina with local Jewish tribes, the direction changed to Mecca. So that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is zakat. That's a Z. Or almsgiving. You are expected to give a certain percentage of your income for the support of the poor. The third is keeping the holy month of Ramadan. Right, so for the 30 days of Ramadan, from sundown, or from sunrise to sunset, you are not supposed to eat, drink anything beyond water that is necessary for your own sustenance, or have sexual intercourse. Right, so it's a period of abstinence. Now, like I said, this is a whole month, so they only do it from sunrise to sunset, right? Because most people recognize that going a whole month without food is insane. You just don't eat during the day. The 4th pillar is the Hajj, or pilgrimage. Right, this is what we were talking about earlier with all of those pilgrims milling around the Kaaba, right, in that sort of central square of Mecca. You are expected, at least once in your life, if you are able, physically, to get there, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, right? Some allowances are made for the sick and for the disabled. Right? If you can't physically get to Mecca, there are other things you can do as a substitute. And the final, and probably most important of the pillars, is Shahada, or confession of faith. This is the phrase that you often see. You see it pop up a few times here, but you also see it in other Islamic texts. There is no God but God, and so on and so forth. When we look at the 1001 Nights, you will notice that characters will tend to recite the Shahada at either times of trial to steel themselves, or at times of great joy as a sort of celebratory gesture, right? But yeah, supposedly this is the thing that makes one a Muslim, is the recitation of the confession of faith, right? That is the one thing that is absolutely necessary to do to become a Muslim. Okay, any questions about any of this so far? Now everybody still follows? Okay. So that's the basic doctrine, right? One more thing about the doctrine, and this sort of relates to the submission idea. I guess this is really 2 more things about the doctrine. First, Christianity and Judaism tend to stress human responsibility for maintaining the relationship with the divine. Now, this varies from denomination to denomination, but by and large, it's regarded as sort of up to human beings to maintain the connection. Human beings are regarded as having some sort of free will and, can choose freely whether to follow or not. The emphasis in Islam is on God's total omnipotence. Nothing can happen, according to Orthodox Islamic thought, if God does not will it so. If God does not will it that a certain group of people be converted, for example, they won't be converted. They will continue to harden their hearts against the prophet and his messengers. If God does not will that you have certain thoughts, you won't have those thoughts, right? The only reason you are able to think or do particular things is because God wills that you can, because God allows you to do that. So one thing that we do see in Islam is a much more, I don't want to say a more powerful idea of God, but a God who is in much more direct control of creation. And indeed, they do see creation as an ongoing process. Right? God did not, to a Muslim, create the world and then step back and rest on the seventh day. The world is still in the process of being created. Right? Yeah, Ashley.
I don't know, just reading certain text, I feel like it's not so much that they view God as being powerful, it's more fearful. They're more it's more like a fear thing. As if they don't take certain things and play them out or follow exactly. If they're more fearful of it than do you know what I'm trying to say?
Well, but on the one hand too, it's so that if he doesn't will you to stray, God won't let you stray.
So they're terrified to stray.
Well, probably no. I mean, most of where they're getting their God concept from is the Old Testament. And if we look at, particularly some of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible,